While Russian troops are massed along the border of Ukraine, it's not just military action Ukrainians are worried about. They're also concerned about cyber attacks. Ukrainian officials say Russia is setting up a destabilization campaign involving attacks on the internet. Officials say the goal is to create panic, with Ukraine's top national security advisor saying, quote, "The number one task for Russia is to undermine us from the inside." The Pentagon says it's something they're watching closely.
It's a piece of the Russian playbook to lay down a foundation for these military action with cyber operations, information operations, even hybrid operations, as we saw back in 2014.
NBC News national security analyst Clint Watts is here to help us understand all this. He's a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Clint, always good to have you with us. So we spend a lot of time talking about the military buildup along Ukraine's border. How much should we pay attention to a possible cyber attack? What is Russia capable of doing?
Yeah, so spokesman Kirby there, what he was explaining is exactly what we saw in 2014 has really been the test ground for all Russian cyber operations since. Over the last 8 years, what you see Russia do in Ukraine is a series of cyber attacks, which are there to do a couple different things. One, psychologically prime the Ukrainian audience for an invasion. Two, create massive problems for the government to try and stabilize itself and ensure communication internally at a time when they're facing off against war. And then I think three is in terms of infrastructure. We've seen them shut the power off before with infrastructure attacks using cyber. This is all meant to destabilize the Ukrainian population. Imagine kicking off a war and you can't communicate inside the country or outside the country. You couldn't even communicate, with Western forces like NATO to really understand what the situation is. This is very devastating for Ukraine and be very tough on its population.
So, Clint, when we talk about 2014 invading and annexing Crimea, what did the U.S. and European allies learn from that? Is Russia likely going to use the same tactics?
I think Russia's been replaying the same playbook. The only difference is the U.S. and Western response has been quite different this time. That hybrid warfare that you talked about in the lead up to this, that essentially is using what we call virtual operations of cyber and information, using disinformation, conspiracy theories in tandem with physical movements. You might remember that Russia actually deployed troops known as Little Green Men. They had no patches on. It was confusing who they were fighting for or working for. There were sets of contractors and cutouts on the ground. This delayed a Western response, which gave Russia the advantage on that invasion into Crimea. They have tried, or at least according to Western intelligence officials, to do something similar, allegedly trying to create a fake video that said that Ukraine was attacking Russia, a potential coup and other provocations, which would be a justification for war. It seems like the West, working with the Ukrainian government, have stymied a lot of those efforts. And then I think the announcement yesterday was a version of this, which President Zelensky had posted on Facebook that the invasion was essentially going to be Wednesday, essentially trying to preempt any Russian action. So we're looking at a very different Western response this time. It's indicative of the lessons learned from 2014. And hopefully we can avoid war in this context.
Which is the goal, of course. I mean, Russia has repeatedly called the concerns of an invasion hysteria from Western countries. Should Western countries like the U.S. be concerned they could be hit by a cyber attack from Russia because of all this in the next few weeks or even days?
I think that's a constant concern, to be honest. I mean, Russian cyber activity, or what we would call sometimes Russian criminal cyber activity. You might remember the ransomware attacks, which are believed to have originated from inside Russia's borders. They are running in parallel all the time. They have extensive capabilities. And if they wanted to harm the U.S. and the West, if they wanted to create a provocation or they wanted to confuse and distract from their real military operations, it's quite plausible they would use cyber. It's a very low-cost, highly effective tool for them to exert power whenever they have an asymmetric advantage. So I think it's a very serious concern, and we'll see how long these diplomatic negotiations play out.
Clint Watts, as always, we appreciate your expertise. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.